Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue à l'Institut Français. Welcome to the French Institute. And thank you for joining us today with this beautiful weather. This event is part of the Beyond Words Festival, celebrating contemporary French literature, fiction and non-fiction, in English, with talks, film, and event fostering dialogue between France and the UK. It's a real pleasure and an honor to welcome Philippe Sands, Bruno Patino, and Claire Armitstead to stage tonight. Many of you will know Philippe from his acclaimed works West Street, Retour à Lemberg, laureate of the Baillie Gifford Prize, and The Right Line. With his new book, 38 Londres Street, I don't even know the title in French. Easy. So he brings us another powerful and deeply personal narrative, one that uncovers a dark and an unexpected thread connecting the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet with Nazi war criminal Walter Rauff. It's a story told with the precision of a courtroom drama, the intimacy of memoir, and the rigor of historical investigation. In conversation with him, Bruno Patino, journalist, CEO of Arte France, the French and German channel, and author of Rire, avec, diable, not yet published in English. Bruno brings his own rich perspective, having reported from Chile during the Pinochet years and reflected deeply on their aftermath in his writing. We have also the pleasure to welcome Claire Armitstead, former associate editor at The Guardian, where she held various roles, including arts editor, literary editor, and head of books. Is that correct? And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Philippe, Bruno, and Claire. Thank you, and enjoy.
Thank you very much. And a bit perversely, I'm the only one on this panel who doesn't speak fluent French, in honor of which we're all speaking in English. Although there may be a few moments when you are forgiven if you revert to French for a few moments. I'm going to start. We're going to start with Bruno because Bruno's involvement with this story goes back 6 years earlier than Philippe's, and it's the memory that I remember of having this extraordinary moment before we knew its significance in law, the imagery of Che Guevara and of Pinochet and of the coup in Allende was so strong at that particular period, and you've completely captured that atmosphere of sort of the chill and the excitement and the sense of something very sinister but also quite exciting that we didn't understand at that point. Will you just explain what you were doing in Chile and where you came in on this?
Thank you. So I will try to speak in English, but I will maybe switch into French if it's too difficult for me. So I arrived in Chile at the beginning of the 90s, but I'm coming from a Franco-South American family. So for me, the two images, let's say, as you mentioned, of Guevara for the revolution and Pinochet being the devil, and let's say the dark side of politics, were very present in my mind. So when I was living in Chile, I became correspondent for a newspaper called Le Monde. And the first thing I tried was not only to understand Chile's recent history, because the coup and Philippe incredible book speaks about the military regime that began with a coup in 1973. And Pinochet lost a referendum in 1988 and had to leave power, let's say the presidency, in March 1990. But then after that, he retreated to being a commander-in-chief of the army. So he was really present, in fact, and we were in those years that was called the transition, and the Chilean would call it la transición. So the enduring question was, when will the transition end? And so you were living in a country where really it was rather strange, because nobody really, the country was still living like in a way very close from the way it was living during the military regime. It was democratized, but you know, the transition, the leeway of the transition, the marge de manœuvre of the transition were very small. And so being there, I tried first to understand what had happened. I went to visit, those visits I put in quote unquote, the places where torture, disappearance had taken place. But at that time, they weren't organized as memory places. They were just normal houses. You could just ring the bell and enter in places where people had been tortured and disappeared. And I was obsessed by the fact to try to meet with the 4 military men that had organized the coup. And so little by little, I ended up meeting with every one of them. I was one of the large number of journalists asked him to meet Pinochet, and the answer that would come was always no. And one day, the positive answer came, and I met him. I was 25 years old then. And this book, this little book, is about memory, knowledge of what has happened, and what can happen when you're facing somebody that for you embodies, let's say, what Hannah Arendt would call the absolute buzzer, the absolute evil in politics. But just to finish, before for Philippe, it was a moment for him, for Pinochet at that moment, impunity, which is a large topic of the book of Philippe, impunity was taken for granted. That wasn't in any way, in any event, its problem. His problem was his legacy. At that moment, in 1992, so 6 years before the event that Philippe is writing about, at that moment, his only thought is to defend his legacy. He wants to be seen as a Chile new founder, Diego Portales, and then Pinochet. And so the moment you meet him at that moment, the impression you get is he has won everything. And the first thing he tells me is that one day I will have my statue here in Santiago, and streets, boulevard will have my name, no doubt about it.
And that you got on so well with him, much to your later worry that you got on with him too well. The title, Rire, avec, diable. But he gave you a present, which you've brought at Philippe's insistence.
Philippe asked me to bring it. Let's be honest. No, I will show it. Yeah, with the signature, and I have to confess, he wrote "con afecto y aprecio," which is for those of you that speak Spanish. Philippe. No, but you know, this is the reason why I wrote the book. In fact, it's a very personal reason, but because it's always a question of what is power and what is in fact the personal relationship we can have with somebody that embodies everything that you hate.
Why did he agree to be interviewed by a 25-year-old French journalist?
I think it's for Le Monde, because Le Monde had opposed so strongly on its policy. He wanted to show Le Monde that he had won. And excuse me the contact, but when we sat down with Pinochet, he put his hand here, like that, during the whole interview, in fact. And you know, the thing I wanted to write about is that knowing what I knew, having interviewed a large number of victims, having seen Calle Londres, Londres Street, 38, having worked with people close from human rights defense, and have been grown up with this image of Pinochet being the absolute evil, doesn't prevent you from having a special relationship with him at the moment you are facing him.
So you point out the pressure on your shoulder and the very, very blue eyes. When you came along, that was 6 years later, he was in a very different state.
I never met him, which is why I'm so thrilled to be on this panel with Bruno, because I handed in my manuscript for 38 Londres Street on the 1st of August, and I was done, I was on holiday, and then I went to our local bookshop in France in the town of Apt, and there I see prominently displayed this new book by Bruno Patino, and I was really pleased to get it, and I read it immediately. It's a short book, you really should read it, it's a wonderful book, and was thrilled to read it. And then when the idea came up that we would be together, I was absolutely delighted, because there is a sort of temporal segue between the two books, in a sense. But I must say, I loved reading your book, and this is the sort of English sense of irony, but when I read on the inscription, "with appreciation and affection," I do wonder what your conversation was. And I know how it is. I know what we write on books, even when they've been very tough questions. But I didn't meet him, as you know, because of my wife. I would have met him.
So it would have. The story is that she's threatened to divorce him.
No, she didn't threaten. She said
it would happen.
She said she would.
If you
100%.
to join the
when
defense.
Pinochet's lawyers asked me to act for him on the morning of the 30th of October 1998, and I managed to defer the question because I'd gone to the cemetery for a ceremony in relation to the death of my grandfather and met my wife at the front gates. And I told her, because I'm an English barrister and I believe in the cab rank principle, which is that we act for everyone who comes to us. We don't pick and choose our clients when it's in the English courts. We're very limited. There are exceptions to the rule, but the rule basically says, like a taxi driver, someone wants to retain your services, you can't say, I don't like their politics, I don't like the colour of their skin, I don't like the direction. We have to do it. And when that morning I got the request, which I didn't accept for family reasons, and I said, I'll call you tomorrow, I was, to be very frank, excited, because it was the most significant case in international criminal justice since Nuremberg. It was the first time in human history that a former leader of a country is indicted for international crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Let's not forget there's a direct connection to East-West Street in the courts of another country. And so this was big. And when I told my lovely wife, with some excitement, Pinochet's lawyers have been in touch, and she said, will you do it? And I said, well, you know, cab rank principle. And she said, yes, I know. She's American. She's an American lawyer. She thinks the cab rank principle is bullshit. And I said, yeah, well, you know, cab rank principle. She said, yeah, do it if you want to do it, but I'll divorce you tomorrow. It wasn't a threat. She doesn't make threats. She does things. And so I was involved. I had a front row seat for the entire process, eventually not acting for Pinochet, but acting against Pinochet, because 3 days later, I was instructed by Human Rights Watch against Pinochet for the extradition to Spain. And then when the medical issue came up about his fitness for trial, I was retained by the government of Belgium to get hold of his medical records. And so I was involved throughout. But I never really wrote about it. I thought about it a lot, and it definitely informed my being. And the moment on the 25th of November 1998 in the House of Lords, the main chamber, when the House of Lords ruled by 3 votes to 2 that he did not have immunity under general international law, was the single most significant moment in my entire legal career. I will never forget that moment. It was as though the entire legal order had changed on its axis. It was not really what we expected. If you're interested, you can just go on the BBC website and just type in for a search, Pinochet judgment, and you will hear the gasps in the chamber when it comes down. And so it was huge. And I parked it, although it informed my being, for 15 years, until, whilst researching the rat line, when dear Horst Wächter had given me access to the entire family archive, 10,000 pages, I come across this letter sent by a man called Walter Ralph to Otto Wächter in Rome. Ralph writes from Syria, Damascus, to where he has fled, telling Wächter, don't head to the Arab world, flee to South America. Wächter dies in mysterious circumstances. For those of you who read the outline, you'll know the story. Ralph then follows the path that he has proposed, ends up in Quito, Ecuador. He is, so you know about Walter Ralph, the man who ran the gas vans across Central and Eastern Europe, responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands of human beings, then head of the Gestapo in Milan, wanted for crimes against humanity and genocide, ends up living for several years in Quito, Ecuador. In 1956, he and his wife Edith meet a charming Chilean couple who say to them, you're in the wrong country, basically. You should be in Chile. We like people like you. There's a wonderful German community, Colonia Dignidad. I don't know whether that came up in conversation. And the Ralphs head to Chile, and they end up settling in Punta Arenas, the southernmost town in the world. There's a very literary aspect to my book, more than the previous ones, because Ralph appears as a character, well, Ralph appears by name in Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, published in 1977, and also in several novels by Roberto Bolaño, published in the 1990s. He becomes a major figure, but he fights off an extradition request to West Germany in 1963 because of a statute of limitations. The Supreme Court says he can't be extradited for genocide and crimes against humanity. And then on the 11th of September 1973, miracle of miracles, his friend from Quito, Ecuador, and Bruno's friend, becomes president of Chile. He leads the coup d'etat, and you couldn't invent it. Pinochet brought Ralph to Chile. And so the immediate moment I worked that out, the question that comes to my mind, and it's the mind of a litigator or an investigative journalist, was there a connection between Ralph and Pinochet in relation to the crimes? And the reason that's of interest to me is that if the answer is yes, there is a direct, unbroken line from Hans Frank in East West Street to Otto Wächter in the Rat Line to Walter Ralph in 38 Londres Street to my desk in London in October 1998. It's a direct line of connection. And I thought, gosh, that would be interesting. So that was what got me going.
So Le Monde had raised the issue of Nazis in Chile in the 1970s.
Yes, but at that moment, in fact, if you look, this was really under the radar, because the only Nazi footprint that was, let's say, talked of or talked about, better said, in the 90s was Colonia Dignidad that Philippe just mentioned, and that he visited. In fact, I didn't, because at that moment the military regime had given extraterritoriality to Colonia Dignidad. So the police was not able to go there, and you couldn't visit it. It was really closed, and Colonia Dignidad was founded by a former SS, who was also was mainly a pedophile. And he created this colony in the south of Santiago, 300 kilometers south from Santiago, a large one, basically based on Nazi principle and having, how would you say that? It was a small town. People who talk German would be dressed like a Bavarian woman or men. Everybody knew that arms trafficking were there. Even when I was working for Le Monde, somebody, I won't mention it, from the French arm industry told me that, you know, there was you couldn't really sell arms to Chile, legally speaking. So they were going through a whole circuit, and at the end, the arms were delivered in Colonia Dignidad. And we also knew from testimony, but at that moment nothing had been found, that torture and disappearance had taken place to Colonia Dignidad. But it was, like, let's say, at that moment perceived like a Nazi exception. We knew that in the torture center there were a lot of Brazilian instructors that were coming from the Brazilian dictatorship, even people coming from Argentina. to help the Chilean torture their prisoners. But the Nazi footprint was something everybody would talk about, but would never be mentioned. You have to see that what is interesting, and really Philippe's book is absolutely fascinating, really incredible, because you have what is, when I really met Pinochet, he wants to show that he's very proud of what he did. So he's trying to rationalize everything that took place. The first one, he was a large, according to him, strategist. There was a war going on in Chile, according to him. So they faked this kind of documents to show that there was a Cuban and Marxist coup going on in Chile, which is an invention, absolutely. But whenever we were speaking about human rights, it said to me nothing to do with human rights. It was an internal war. We had to fight an internal war, and the people that died in a war. And so there was no guilt. There was an amnesty law voted in 78 in Chile, promulgated by the military regime in 78. So the whole philosophy was, you have to forget everything. He said, even erase. He tells me at least 10 times, tenemos que borrar. We have to erase everything. So in fact, everything that pointed out something coming from Nazis, otherwise was really strongly hidden, in fact. They were really proud of what they said. Everybody knew about the Dawson concentration center, but being a Chilean product, the Center for Torture, but this connection, this possible connection between the DINA, who was the secret police, and Nazis, some rumors were going on, but nobody had been able to prove it until now.
Until now. So the key distinction which changed everything was changing from an accusation of murder to torture. Because explain this.
I mean, like all of my books, there are rabbit holes and there are complexities. And I think the reason I've chosen to write in that way is that is the reality of life. When you're doing a case, it isn't simple. You don't say, oh, I'm going to prove this. It's a huge effort, looking for documents, interviewing people, chasing wildly things that lead nowhere, and then eventually you get a breakthrough. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got in writing East-West Street from my wonderful editor at Alfred Knopf, who's now retired, Vicky Wilson, was, Philippe, don't just tell the readers who are intelligent what you found, tell them how you found it. I mean, for a lot of people, or for some people, it's just too much. But for those who stick with it, it means you've gone through the process of basically speaking to everyone who's involved, all of the judges, all of the lawyers on all sides. It's a balanced book. I've spoken to a lot of Pinochet's lawyers.
One of your great friends was on the other side of it.
When I turned it down, my closest friend in the world took the brief that I didn't take.
So you see, you have friends also on the other side.
You've also laughed with the devil.
But what you find out is that when you begin the process of talking to people, firstly, I have a number of very happy, lucky coincidences in my life. My next door neighbor, who'd never given an interview to anyone, happens to be the duty magistrate on the evening of the 16th of October 1998, who receives a visit from 4 Scotland Yard officers and is asked to sign the arrest warrant of Augusto Pinochet. And as he tells me, as I put in the book, he said to me, he's a wonderful person, and he said to me, Philippe, it was 1998. I didn't do international law like you. It's just not my area. They told me this name, Pinochet. I didn't really know who it was. And then they gave me this piece of paper, arrest for genocide and crimes against humanity. I didn't know what these things meant, or torture. So I just crossed those words out. And I wrote murder. And that was nearly catastrophic because the English courts don't have jurisdiction for the crime of murder perpetrated by a non-British person in a foreign country. It's as simple as that. And Garzón in Spain had to issue a second arrest warrant to cover up that miss. But what I read with such interest in Bruno's book was so I, of course, did not meet Pinochet, but I've dealt with many people who did meet Pinochet. And some of my favorite characters are the people who engaged directly with him. I think of all the people in the book, my very favorite character is Jean Pateras, the interpreter, a remarkable person, Chilean British national, retained by Scotland Yard on the afternoon of the 16th of October 1998, top secret, we're going off to issue an arrest warrant. Bloke doesn't speak English, we need a Spanish speaker. Are you able to come, Jean, at short notice? We can't tell you who it is. She accepts, they toddle off to Scotland Yard. From Scotland Yard, they head to Devonshire Place, the London Clinic. They go in, up the elevator to the 8th floor, room 801. And of course, the amazing thing is you're with the person who basically arrested Augusto Pinochet. And she tells him, you are, I mean, for you, it must have been weird to read it. I'm informing you on behalf of Scotland Yard that you are under arrest for murder and on the basis of an arrest warrant for genocide and crimes against humanity. And of course, the first thing I say to Jean is, well, how did he react? What did he do? And she said, oh, he sat bolt upright in his bed in his pajamas and said, I know the fucking communist who's behind this. And
This sounds like him, yes?
And he got it right, actually. It was Juan Garcés. He got it exactly right. And so you begin to pick up accounts. And from Jean, who was then the only person who was involved, she literally wheeled him onto the plane 503 days later. At every key moment, she is there, Zelig-like, observing. She sees him when the judgment comes down. She's with him in the room when the judgment comes down on the 25th of November 1998. How did he react? He said, oh, they were all celebrating, the suitcases were ready to go, the Burberry's bags, the Harrods bags, the books about Napoleon, the Star Wars movies, and they were eating dulce de leche in vast quantities, and then the judgment comes down. How did he react? He wept, which I think is really, really interesting. And then, of course, you go forward nearly a year, and this is the second. My book is two investigations. Did Pinochet retain the assistance of Walter Rauff, who ran the gas vans? And then equally significantly, but it's a different story, was there an agreement between Britain and Chile to send Pinochet back on the false claim that he was unfit for trial? And in relation to that, in relation to both questions, I reach, in my view, complete certainty. And in relation to that second question, fitness for trial, it is Jean who first alerts me to what's going on, because she gives me a great story of coming to see him one day and with Scotland Yard whenever they need an interpreter, and he says to her, this is about September 99, he's been under arrest for a year and living in sort of, Jean says, a very grotty house in Wentworth. Jean couldn't stand him, really couldn't stand him. And she says, yes, well, he said to me, Jean, something extraordinary happened yesterday. A lady came to visit me. And we had a very agreeable afternoon talking about this and that. And then after she left, I said to the police officers, I didn't know who she was. And they told me it was my wife, Lucia. And he just said, come on, pull the other one. And he grins. And it turns out, and Bruno and I have been talking about this today, they'd produced a dossier to train him on how to fake dementia and being gaga. It is literally as simple as that. I met those who produced the 10-page dossier. It really is stunning. That, when the book came out in Chile, which it did a month ago, as it did in England, has caused a mini scandal in which the ministers then involved had to put out a public statement saying it's untrue that they don't deny there was a dossier. They say it's untrue that that the government had any involvement in preparing a dossier to train General Pinochet on how to fake dementia. But interestingly, in their public statement, they don't deny there was an agreement to send him back. It's very interesting. You learn in life, whether you're a lawyer or a journalist, to read not only what people do say, but what they don't say. And that's often much more important. And one of the early clues that I'd got, many of us had always had the hunch there'd been something amiss, something else had happened, was if you read Tony Blair's memoir, and actually I'm just going to do my usual test. Who here has read Tony Blair's memoir? This is an almost unanimous pattern. I did an event at the South Bank a week ago, and there were about 600 people, and 2 people put their hands up. But the thing that's amazing is the Pinochet case, Bruno can give his perspective, was basically the most important case in 50 years on international crimes by a leading figure. Claire has just said how significant Pinochet was. It went on for 2 years in Britain. It caused huge embarrassment with the Lenny Hoffman affair, when it turned out that one of the judges had a relationship with Amnesty International, which had intervened in the case, causing untold mayhem. What does Tony Blair say about the Pinochet case and Chile in his memoir? Nothing. I know that when a politician doesn't want to talk about something, they don't write about it in their memoir. There's a reason he doesn't want to write about it, and that's because he doesn't want to talk about it, and there's a reason he doesn't want to talk about it. And that's the kind of clue you would begin to put together, and I would begin to put together.
It's a bit more difficult for a journalist, though, isn't it? Because you kind of have to have the evidence.
No, well, sorry about it, but when I read Philippe's book, I said, he's one of the most efficient journalists I ever read. Sorry about it, but I mean, it's an investigative journalist. But you know, the fascinating thing is that, in fact, what is the moment Pinochet goes back to Santiago, in fact, legally speaking, you could say he won, but historically speaking, he lost. Because it's the moment where everything goes in reverse in Chile, where memories come up, where the Supreme Court, as you mentioned in your book, some few months before, has allowed the amnesty law not to be applied at every moment. And so the fascinating story is that it's really a victory, that it's a defeat, in fact, because historically speaking, he lost everything. And so in a way, it's a very, you could always advocate being the Chilean government.
But in a sense, and I agree with you, in the end, he dies under house arrest, serially indicted, can't even walk on the streets of his own town. He's broken, but the loss is self-induced. The moment that many people remember is the arrival...
Yeah, when he stands up.
Well, when he stands up and starts, you know, this guy who's supposed to be demented, gaga, unfit for trial,
hello,
suddenly, you know, is wheeled off the plane, and the moment the wheelchair's on the tarmac, he stands up. And Jack Straw told me the moment he saw that, basically he realized he'd made a mistake, and he should have sent him to Madrid. But the story behind that also is fascinating, and it ties into your account of the man. On day one of the proceedings in the House of Lords in November 1998, you know, there's only about 100 people in the room, and I'm sitting, you know, my chair is even closer. I sit next to a man who is incredibly elegant. His hair's fantastic. He smells fantastic. He's just, and he stands up.
A lawyer.
And he introduces himself, Miguel Schweitzer, Augusto Pinochet's human rights advisor, 1975 to 1984. And I'm thinking, okay. But the thing is, we became mates. You know, our politics are very different. And he, as you now know, having read the book, has been involved. I mean, in 1963, as an 18-year-old, I will later discover, Miguel Schweitzer helped his father, Miguel Schweitzer Sr., the professor of criminal law in Santiago, to write the brief that will get Ralph off the hook. Everything is connected. It's unbelievable. And Miguel and I basically became mates of a sort. And we stayed in touch for the next 20 years, and he gave me wonderful interviews. And he said the reason he was willing to give me the interviews was that he'd read East West Street and The Rat Line and saw that I treated people I disagreed with respectfully, courteously. I didn't trash them. I gave them the space to tell their stories. It was really heartening to hear that. And Miguel told me what happened with the wheelchair incident, that it was a very long flight because he said Uruguay and Argentina and Brazil would not allow them to fly over their airspace, so they had to go all the way down to the bottom and then all the way up the other side. And as they were preparing to land, Miguel and his other lawyer, Hernan Felipe Errázuriz, said to General Pinochet, look, no, you can't walk off the plane. You're supposed to be demented and unfit for trial. So you're going to have to go off in this wheelchair. And he was a very proud man, they said. And he refused. He said, I'm not getting off in a wheelchair. And then eventually they explained to him that it would get him into great difficulty for his future cases in Chile, so he had to get off in the wheelchair. And then Miguel just smiled and just said, we screwed up. Because we forgot to tell him to wait until the wheelchair was in the terminal out of sight of the cameras before he got out of the wheelchair. And he said the moment was catastrophic. It was catastrophic. Everyone knew at that moment he'd gone back on a lie. They couldn't prove it. It's taken another 25 years. I've now found the negotiators of the agreement, and a remarkable Chilean diplomat called Christian Tolosa, who agreed to speak to me and tell me the whole story. And the Chileans played a blinder. They hired Tolosa because he was Frey's chief speechwriter, and he had done a PhD in psychology at Exeter University, and he was thought to understand how the British mind works and to design a strategy. And eventually the strategy leads him to his counterpart, who is none other than the chief of staff at 10 Downing Street, Jonathan Powell. And I've interviewed at length both Christian and Jonathan, and they've both confirmed exactly the same story about the deal. So there's no question about that now. But he returned on a lie, and this, I think, leaves a bad taste for a lot of people.
I want to just go back to the absolutely basic question I probably should have asked right at the beginning. Why was he tried in England? Why? I mean, you couldn't imagine a Latin American dictator being tried in England now, could you?
No, you totally can. So if you go back to Nuremberg, these new crimes are put in place: crimes against humanity, no torture, genocide, so on and so forth. And at the same time, a new set of international rules is developed on the principle of universal jurisdiction. There are some crimes that are so terrible that any national court, as opposed to an international court, has jurisdiction to try those crimes. And so the Spanish courts, the way the case begins is that in 1996, in April, a group of Chilean refugees in Madrid go to a Spanish prosecutor, not Garzón, Carlos Castrosana, who's in a sense the real hero who started the whole case, and say to him, look, we see there's a universal jurisdiction case started against the Argentines. Could you do one against Pinochet? And he looks into it and says, yes, actually, there is a basis in Spanish law. But I have to say, the Spanish courts are very conservative, so could you go away and find me a Spanish victim rather than just a Chilean victim? Because I think that will make it much more difficult for the Spanish judges to say, no, we're not going to deal with this. So they go away, they come back with 4 names, and Castrosana described to me how they choose the Spanish victim who is going to start the whole Pinochet case. And they choose a man called Carmelo Soria, who is the head of the UN office in Santiago, who was disappeared on the 14th of July 1976. And a few days later, his body is found in a canal. He has been killed by the Pinochet regime. And they select, Castrosana selects Soria because he comes from a very well-known Spanish family. Arturo Soria, his great-grandfather, is a big urban designer. There's a street in Madrid called Soria, Avenida Soria. There's, I think, even a tube station, Soria. And Carmelo's brother, Arturo, was the publisher of Pablo Neruda. So he's very well known in Spain. So they take that case, and with that case, they start the proceedings in Spain, which eventually leads to Garzón when it is discovered that Pinochet is in London. One of the big curious reveals in the book that I was very surprised about was that Garzón initially was not going to issue an arrest warrant. He was going to ask a series of interrogatories, questions for Pinochet. He then receives a phone call on the morning of the 16th of October 1998, alerting him to the fact that Pinochet is leaving back for Chile the next morning, so if he's going to do anything, do it now. He immediately, in the space of less than an hour, writes out an arrest warrant for genocide, crimes against humanity, genocide, torture on the basis of universal jurisdiction. And that is what makes its way to London. Interestingly, the phone call has come from a diplomat at the British Embassy, which is itself, I think, really interesting. And I've spoken to that diplomat and got the whole story on what happened there. But almost amazingly, for those of you who've read East West Street and know how that is essentially the story of my grandfather and my family story, in this book, when I was told this story by Carlos Castrosana, I didn't know the name Carmelo Soria. And later, after I'd finished the Zoom call, because it was during COVID that we spoke in May 2021, I was with my wife and my mother-in-law in Totnes. My mother-in-law is Spanish. She's a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. And they ended up in 1939, 1940 at Dartington School in Totnes, taken in by the Elmhursts. And having dinner with my mother-in-law, I told her the story of what had happened. And she looked at me and said, what was the name of the Spanish gentleman again who was arrested, whose death caused the whole Pinochet case to be started? And I said, Carmelo Soria. And she looks at me and she pauses and she says, of course, I'd forgotten. Cousin Carmelo. And I'm straight in. I've got family in Chile, it turns out, through my wife. I had no idea. We had no idea. When we did the Pinochet case, she never said anything. She just had, with time, the brain operates in strange ways. And later that afternoon, I was on with the Sorias, talking to Carmelo's widow, and have become very close to his daughter, Carmen, who is a remarkable person. Did you come across? You didn't come across. No.
So talk about the French connection. He claimed to have had French ancestry, didn't he?
No, so we had this meeting and this interview, in fact, and the thing I really wanted in this interview is at a moment that he confesses human rights violation. He had never did that before, and the strange thing is that he did at a moment. At a moment, I said to him, don't you have any regrets in life? And he said, no, absolutely not. And at a moment, you made some special jokes when they discovered bodies. In the cemetery of Santiago, they discovered that some tombs had 2, 3, 4 bodies. Of course, people that had been tortured and killed and had been buried there. And Pinochet's reaction was the people who did that were really saving the state's money, And I said, this was a kind of bad taste joke. And he said to me, yes, maybe, but 2,000, 3,000 people, it's nothing. In China, they killed millions of people and they don't make a fuss about it. And at the moment, I realized that this kind of confession were useless, in fact. They were useless because, and maybe I will tell the story of the postcard, but maybe we can talk about the fear, because I think the thing that London, the arrest changed everything, is the fear that at the moment a country experienced. But to tell you the anecdote, so we had a long conversation, and Pinochet was, you have to understand it, you wouldn't say he was not well-read, but he had this kind of politician intelligence, but he comes from a kind of modest background. And the Chilean society is a very aristocratic society, very hierarchized, you know, in English, hiérarchisé, très hiérarchisé. And so he was always taken for a huaso, that said in Chile, that is a peasant coming from downstairs. So in Chile, if you want, at that moment, if you wanted to see that you were, you know, you had grounds to vindicate that you belong to the high society, you had to show some European blood. And so at a moment he came and he showed to me a postcard. And the postcard was coming from Saint-Malo in France and was really sent, I tell the story in the book, was sent in 1973. And it was very simple. In the postcard said, Président Pinochet, Santiago, Chile. And for the text, the text was, Dear President Pinochet, we are the family Pinochet in Saint-Malo. It has come to our knowledge that you are now the president of Chile, as if no coup had taken place. And so we wanted to congratulate you, and maybe we have some connections between. And so he was very proud to show that, and he told me, you know, nous sommes compatriotes. He didn't speak like that. His voice was like that. He spoke like that. Which was really counterintuitive, because you imagine a dictator having a strong voice, and he had this very, 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 this kind of voice. Okay. And
I love the postcard thing. I've been in Vienna for the last 2 days doing the launch in Austria of the book, and one of the events that I did was at the Simon Wiesenthal Institute. And the director said to me, well, the context of this was that Simon Wiesenthal hunted him for years and years and years. And Ralph really hated Wiesenthal and was terrified that he was going to be subject to an Eichmann-style procedure. And so there's, you know, I've got correspondence from Ralph to his sister in West Germany, and he would sort of clip photographs of Wiesenthal and send them, that this horrible man is still chasing me. But the director of the Wiesenthal Institute, apropos postcards, said to me, you know, the Austrian postal service really is amazing. We've got a whole collection of postcards sent to Simon Wiesenthal, but not by name. There'll just be a postcard in which all it says in the address is, that Jewish swine in Vienna. And it's delivered to the Wiesenthal Institute. I mean, it's...
So here and in fact the story is very simple. He might have some French blood, because in fact, you know, the people were fishing whales, were coming from Saint-Malo, and so they were fishing whales near Punta Arenas, but they would then go to Valparaiso in order to rest. And so Valparaiso was a huge port, so you had those kind of, how to say that in English, you know, the places where you have the prostitutes and les filles à marins, as we said, and so it is probable that Pinochet comes de façon lointaine d'une fille à marin et d'un marin malouin. So, but he wanted desperately to show that he had some French blood.
It was superior French blood.
Superior French blood, but just maybe 30 seconds, because it's very important what, you know, I don't want to be an advocate for the Chilean government of Eduardo Frei. But when we lived in Santiago in the 90s, you could still experience the fear. People were terrified. And I can tell you that and Pinochet did everything to have people terrified, even the government. And I remember, I have just a remembrance to share, and that in 1993, in May, a newspaper at a moment published a story about, let's say, Pinochet's son and money problems, about checks. This article was sufficient to shut down the capital for almost one week, called El Boinas. So you mentioned Boinas Negras in your book. And so at a moment, the Santiago, the city was shut down. You would see the military and Pinochet himself in combat uniform. And I can tell you, the president at that moment was in Denmark. So the acting president was the interior minister, a tall guy, I mean, overweight and speaking like that. And you could see, we could see them as journalists. They were absolutely terrified. So you had the European embassies, you had the US embassies, telling them nothing will happen. The United States, the European community won't support any coup. You had even military sources telling us journalists there is absolutely no chance that you can have a coup attempt because nobody in the Marine or in the Air Force will follow Pinochet. But that's the reasoning. You could feel that the government was terrified. And I could realize that he was terrified, and when he was arrested in London, this is the moment, it seems to me.
But the irony is that the Chileans used the fear of another coup to get him back to Chile. Christian Tolosa explained to me that when he went to 10 Downing Street, he would say to the British, look, we have a very fragile democracy. Do you really want to be the government that causes the military to take over again in Chile? Yes. And the fear was, I think, just not only instrumentalized, but palpable. It was still there in 98, 99, 2000, and it was articulated.
And I want to ask one last question while you're thinking of your questions, because we're going to take questions from the floor in a second. We started with the images, photographic images of people, but you're both very good writers about place. Part of these books are both about place. Obviously, Philippe, your book is actually titled 38 Londres Street, after this particular building. But you also, Bruno, come across a door. Tell the story of the door. It's a sort of very chilling postscript.
Oh yes, I came back to Chile beginning 2024, and I could see how maybe in the aftermath of everything that Philippe writes about, the city has changed. You have a statue of Allende now near La Moneda. And at a moment, I came across in Calle Morandé. Calle Morandé is a street. La Moneda, the palace, the presidential palace, is in between two streets, among them Morandé. And there is this door of Morandé 80. And when I was a journalist in '92, I wanted to write a story of the door of Morandé 80, because it was a kind of private door for presidents. But the day of the coup, the last surviving people from La Moneda came through that door before being arrested, and some of them sent it to Dawson Island.
And Allende's body was...
And Allende bodies, most of all, was removed through that door. Il était entouré d'un aguayo bolivien, and his corpse, after he committed suicide, was exited through that door. And the military regime, to show the fight for memory, just had that door closed. And it was transformed into a window. So the door didn't exist anymore. And in 2003, they opened that door. They opened that door at the same time as they opened a lot of memory places. I didn't know that in 2024, so at the moment I saw that door, and the door is back, and I have some friends in La Moneda now, and so they helped me go through that door. I know when you enter that door, you have stairs. And the stairs are taking you, I write that in the book, taking you to Allende's office. It's not the real office, it's been relocated in another place in La Moneda, but the real furnitures are there. So you can see the desk of Allende, the things he was written before the coup take place. You can also see a statue that was hit by rifle bullets, and it's almost half destroyed by the bullets. You have also Allende's shoes, because you know the presidential palace was the bombs were falling on the presidential palace, so a fire took place. So you can see everything about it, and I was really overwhelmed.
So it's
at
like
that
a
moment.
Door. That door is such
So
a
that door
powerful
is
image.
like the memory, and said to me, it's like you can at least enter into the door of memory that allows you to really feel what that moment was like.
And so both of these books are doors, in a way, into bigger and more specific histories. I'm going to open it up to the floor, because I'm sure you will have questions to ask of your own. Do we have anybody who's going to be brave and ask the first one? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, why did Simon Wiesenthal not succeed where you did? Was that because the trail went cold, or because
spoiler alert.
Chile helped make the trail go cold, or why did he not succeed?
Spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, shut your ears and don't listen to what I'm about to say. There was a very sustained effort on the part of Wiesenthal and others to locate him, to get him extradited, to get him expelled, and it came to naught. But in parallel with that, and I think also involving a certain role by Wiesenthal, in June 1979, Walter Rauff had retired and was living in Santiago, and he received a phone call from his son that one of his old comrades was in Santiago and had turned up at the house by phone and would like to see him. The person concerned was called Karl Wolff, and Karl Wolff was Heinrich Himmler's number 2, and he was the head of Nazi-occupied Italy right at the end of the war, and it was he who negotiated an arrangement with Alan Dulles, Operation Sunrise, to basically down tools and bring the war to an end in Italy. Wolff said, I'm here for a few days, I'm writing my memoirs, can I come and see you? I'm in the company of a German writer. Rauff is utterly thrilled, and they spend 4 days together in the company of the German writer, who records all of the conversations and who takes lots of photographs. And all of those have been made available to me. And the visit ends, giving of books, raising of toasts, good old days, blah, blah, blah. The German writer doesn't really say exactly who he is. He's actually a very famous German journalist for Stern magazine called Gerd Heidemann. And some of you will remember Gerd Heidemann as the architect of the Hitler Diaries. So Rauff never knows that this is a journalist. But what the world never knows is what happened next, until I discovered it by speaking to various people in Jerusalem. After seeing Rauff, they go off and see Klaus Barbie, and they go on the hunt for Bormann and Mengele without success. It's a 2-month boys' trip to South America. Heidemann returns home to Hamburg, and he writes up a lengthy and detailed report with photographs, including photographs of Rauff's house, the dimensions of the windows, the dimensions of the doors, the distance between the front gate and the front door. Unbelievable detail. Packages the material and gives it to another person in Hamburg who is a senior agent of Mossad. Gerd Heidemann was a Mossad agent, which is not known, and in the German newspapers have got interested, obviously, in this. And 6 months later, Mossad sends a hit squad to Santiago, and I have the full account of what happened from Mossad documents. And they very nearly succeed, but they don't succeed because of Rex. Rex is the utterly vicious Alsatian dog that has been given to him by the owner of the Pesquera Camello in Punta Arenas, with whom he has worked for 15 plus years. And the dog has such a propensity to make noise that the two members of the assassination squad decide they can't do it without drawing massive attention to themselves, and they abort the mission on 2 occasions, and they never come back. So I think Ralph never knew what happened to him. I know his grandson. It touched me very much that his grandson came to the launch of the book with his daughter, so Ralph's granddaughter, great-granddaughter, in Santiago, and he didn't know anything about the story until the book came out. I hadn't told him beforehand. I hadn't told anyone, and he was pretty shocked. So they kept very close, but not quite there.
Yes, just there, yes, in the second row. And then there, and then I think that's about all we've got time for.
It's okay. Yes, thank you. It has been very, very interesting. I'm from Chile. I studied law, qualified in Chile as a lawyer. So I had the unfortunate experience of sharing times before the coup, where it was very clear the role that the civilians were having in cooking this coup. And it was absolutely clear through the newspapers, through the courts. And then when the coup happened, I hadn't qualified yet, but I continued studying. I took my final exams, and the atmosphere certainly has changed dramatically from the time that I was a student to the time that I went to take my final exams. Because then you have to identify yourselves, produce your documents, etc., etc. Then I qualified and then start working in human rights. I was a human rights lawyer during the unimaginable conditions that they were at the time. And many colleagues were arrested.
Try again.
Yeah, sorry. Many colleagues were arrested, and I think that eventually this air and certainty that they had that they were invincible became stronger in the Pinochet camp. I think that they felt that they had such a strong support from the USA and other sectors in the Chilean society that they felt that nothing was going to happen.
Thank you very much. Did you have a question?
Yes. My question is, do you think that the case that this very important case where jurisdiction was applied to a mass murderer like Pinochet, it's likely or not to happen somewhere else? I found it very unlikely.
This is what we've touched a bit on, haven't we?
No, it's happening everywhere. I mean, it doesn't get a lot of attention because, regrettably, all the media attention is on the cases before the international courts. But where the real action is in proceedings before national courts. For example, when I launched the book in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, a lady came up to me, I was in The Hague, and she introduced herself to me as the head of the International Crimes Unit in the District Court of The Hague. I said, do you have cases on genocide, crimes against humanity? She said, many. And I know from other courts in France, in Germany, in Austria, to a certain extent in the United Kingdom, the Pinochet precedent has had huge, huge consequences. That is established and clear and irrefutable. But I just want to touch on one aspect of something you just briefly mentioned, because it's very important in relation to that part of the story that I wrote about with Walter Rauff, the role of the non-military part of society. And this really is a pretty dismal story. All of the cases in Chile, which really only came following Pinochet's return, are in relation to the military and the DINA. And the private sector has got off scot-free. But the crucial aspect of the Ralph story, again, spoiler alert, is that the crimes in which Ralph was involved absolutely engaged the DINA. But the story that I uncovered was that on the 11th of September 1973, the Pinochet regime acquired another pesquera, the Pesquera Arauco in San Antonio on the Pacific coast. And they acquired the Pesquera Arauco because it had a fleet of 310 Chevrolet C10 and C30 refrigerated vans. And it also had the largest fish meal production plant in Chile, 30 tons a day. Those vehicles, the C10 and the C30 refrigerated vehicles, were used by the DINA and the military to transport detainees. I met many people who were transported in those refrigerated vans, and then used to dispose of and disappear bodies. And Ralph was involved in the use of those vans. In other words, and this is really pretty shocking, he returned the skills he had developed in using gas vans to disappear people in 1941 and 1942, and now moved to the use of refrigerated vans to disappear people. Remarkably, I mentioned earlier, there is literature in Chile which touches on the relationship, but the piece that touches me the most in relation to this issue is a newspaper article of about 1,000 words by the poet Pablo Neruda, published in July 1965. It's not rumor, it's not myth, I've got the article, in which he does two things. The first thing he does is he decries the pusillanimity of the Chilean courts in failing to extradite Walter Ralph to West Germany, a disgrace, he says. And the second thing he does, and this is 1965, is he writes, what we can say with certainty about this man, Ralph, is that he knows everything about vans. And that was 8 years before the dictatorship started using the vans of the Pesquera Arauco to do the kinds of things. And may I just finish by saluting you for your efforts in that really difficult period. I've met others. Thank you for what you tried to do in an impossible, impossible time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's, we have, I think we're going to have one more, if we can have a quick one, we're slightly over time. Two quick ones.
One, would you have taken Pinochet case? Would your wife have allowed you? and then you wouldn't have the book. And the second, how do you keep your objectivity when you're writing? And for you, was there a commission, una Comisión de la Verdad in Chile? And would that have made a difference comparing with Argentina? Thank you.
You want me to start? Well, you know, it's. I'm trying to have a quick answer to that because what your point is very important. Pinochet left power after an election, an electoral defeat. His regime didn't fail, in fact. So the transition time was a time of negotiation, and the civilian power came with an idea that was justicia en la medida de lo posible. Justice dans la mesure du possible in French, you will, to the extent of possible. But in fact, they created a system which was la Comisión Verdad y Reconciliación, DOC, the Rhetoric Commission, in fact, that worked during 12 months. And I've met one of the men that really imagined that system. He was called José Salaquet, and really he had read the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. And the whole system was, we have to identify the victim. When we identify the victim, then we point at au bourreau, là c'est mon anglais, to the murderer, and the murderer have to ask for forgiveness. And if you remember very well, I mean, the Rettig report was published in March '91, and there were like 2 or 3 weeks of internal debate. Should part of the army ask for forgiveness or not? And the case was shut down when one of the military regime ideologues called Jaime Guzman was shut down in April '91. He was in favor, he was speaking with journalists saying that he was in favor of a small demand of forgiveness by the military regime. And Pinochet had this moment absolutely to shut down. And it was, in fact, a kind of stalemate, because then the democratic regime was without any solution. The amnesty law was taking place, and Pinochet was really the one main military man that said, when you have saved your country, you don't ask for forgiveness. He told me that. So in fact, this system of Comisión Verdad y Reconciliación that was really tried, and really they hoped to achieve some results in that moment, was really in a way without ending. And everything changed in '98 with the arrest in London.
Thank you.
I think, as I described, no, I mean, I would have done the case for Augusto Pinochet, and my life would have taken a completely different turn, I have no doubt. But I was saved, not for the first time, by my wife, to whom I am still very happily married 27 years later. So, that was clear. I mean, the objectivity thing is something I think about a lot. And I think I'm assisted by my other life, both as an academic and as a lawyer acting before international courts. You are much less credible as an advocate if you appear to be overly passionate about your case, if you appear to be unable to recognize the strengths of the other side. And so if you've read any of my books, you'll know with East-West Street, with the Rat Line, and now with this one, I bend over backwards to speak to people from all different perspectives and to treat them respectfully in how I deal with them. And I've had some critiques, that I was in the Rat Line too nice to Horst Wächter, and in this one that I was too generous to Miguel Schweitzer. But I don't agree with those critiques. I've just allowed their words to speak for themselves. And one of the lessons that I have picked up from various writer friends, and it's rather like being a barrister before an international court, don't tell the international judges what the answer is. Give them the material, lay it out, and do so in a way that leads them possibly to the conclusion you wish them to come to. Never say to an international judge, this is what you should do. They really don't like it. And it's the same with readers. I think readers are really smart. And as some of you know, my neighbour for more than 20 years was John le Carré. And I had a role in his last 10 or 12 novels. Every novel he wrote contains a disgusting lawyer. He hated lawyers. And my role was to make sure that the lawyer was portrayed accurately, dressed like a lawyer, spoke like a lawyer, acted like a lawyer. And we would engage a lot on his books. He never had put little yellow sticky saying the lawyer's at page 320. I'd have to read all 500 pages, and I came to understand how he wrote. And we would talk about how he wrote, and he was dealing with really complex material. And he said his idea was the reader thinks that they are smarter than the writer, and very often they are. They want you to lay out the material in a way in which you don't impose your conclusions on them, but allow them to believe they can reach the conclusion before you come to your big reveal. And that was very good advice And I've had no critiques for East West or The Rat Line or for this one so far, it's only a month in, that it's biased, it's pushing in one direction or another. And ultimately, as you will know if you read the book, I only came to the conclusions I came to because of some lucky breaks right at the end. And in the end, it was not speaking to the victims that led me to where I wanted to get to, or where I hoped I might get to in terms of the question of whether Ralph was involved with Pinochet. It was gritting my teeth and speaking to two former DINA agents and going with them to places of mass killing. And it's a very painful thing to do, but it's the only way you can build up the trust to get people to talk to you and tell you what happened and who they saw and what they saw and what those people were doing. So the upshot is a degree of objectivity is imposed on me by the method by which I tell the story and write. But there's no such thing as absolute truth and absolute objectivity. And I'm an advocate, and the way in which I string together the story, of course, consciously or subconsciously, just as with advocacy before a court, hopes that it might lead the reader to a particular view. But it may not, and readers will come to their own.
You'll have to discover this in your own time when you buy the book and read it and get it signed by Philippe afterwards, now.
Thank you. So thank you for this amazing conversation. Thank you, Claire, for your moderation. And thank you very much, Bruno and Philippe. You have to buy books. And Philippe and Bruno would be able to sign. Thank you very much.